Beef, capitalism, and the right to food. When food becomes a commodity, everyone loses. Comrades, neighbors, farmers, ranchers, workers, and everyone who has to buy groceries. We need to ask a simple question: who should control the food we eat? The people who produce it and consume it, or corporations, politicians, commodity markets, and distant bureaucracies? The recent decision by Trump administration to temporarily expand access for imported beef is a perfect example of the contradictions of capitalism. Trump says importing as much as 300,000 metric tons of ground beef over 90 days will help lower grocery prices, but cattle producers have warned that flooding the market with cheaper foreign beef could undermine domestic ranchers and discourage them from rebuilding herds. Economists have also questioned whether the imports are large enough to substantially reduce retail prices. So the question isn't simply American beef or foreign beef. The deeper question is, why does feeding people have to be organized around profit in the first place? The farmer gets squeezed from both directions. American farmers and ranchers are caught in a system they don't control. They pay for land, they pay for feed, they pay for fuel, they pay for fertilizer, they pay for veterinary care, they pay interest on debt. They deal with drought, weather, disease, regulation, transportation costs, and increasingly concentrated meat processing industries. Then they sell their cattle into a market where the enormous corporations have vastly greater bargaining power. Meanwhile, consumers walk into grocery stores and encounter expensive meat. The farmer doesn't necessarily receive the price the consumer pays. The consumer doesn't necessarily know who produced the food. And the people controlling processing, distribution, financing, and retail systems can capture enormous portions of the value created by everyone else. That is the capitalist food chain. The farmer produces, the worker processes, the trucker transports, the grocery worker sells, the consumer pays, the corporation controls the system. And then politicians tell us the solution is simply to manipulate imports, tariffs, subsidies, and trade agreements. This isn't liberation. That's rearranging the machinery. What about bioengineered or genetically modified beef? We should also be careful here. There is a legitimate reason to demand transparency about biotechnology and industrial food production, but we shouldn't claim that imported beef under Trump's current policy is genetically engineered when there is no evidence establishing that. Instead, the communist anarchist position should be: we demand to know what is in our food, where it came from, how animals were raised, how they were processed, and who controlled every stage of production. If biotechnology is used, people deserve meaningful disclosure. If animals are raised using particular drugs, feed systems, or technologies, people deserve transparency. If meat comes from thousands of miles away, consumers should know. If corporations want to experiment with new technologies in food supply, communities should have a voice. Food should not become a laboratory controlled by corporations, while ordinary people are expected to simply trust the label. The principle is simple: no secret food system. The health question: industrial meat production raises legitimate questions about food safety, antibiotic resistance, contamination, processing practices, environmental pollution, and the nutritional consequences of heavily processed diets. But we shouldn't exaggerate those concerns into unsupported claims that imported beef is automatically poisonous or genetically engineered. The better argument is stronger. People should have the power to know exactly how their food was produced. Safety of food should not depend upon corporate secrecy, and healthy food shouldn't be something available only to people who can afford premium prices at specialty stores. The capitalist food system creates artificial scarcity. Looking at the contradiction, America has enormous agricultural capacity. We have farmers, we have ranchers, we have farmland, we have workers, we have machinery, we have knowledge. Yet people struggle to afford food. Why? Because food is not organized primarily around satisfying human need. It is organized around exchange value and accumulation of capital. A cow becomes a commodity, land becomes an investment, seeds become intellectual property, water becomes a resource to be controlled, processing plants become assets, grocery stores become chains, and food becomes something that must generate profit at every stage. The result is absurd. We can have agricultural abundance and food insecurity at the same time. A communist anarchist alternative, a communist anarchist food system would begin with a completely different principle from each according to ability to each according to need. Food production would be organized around human need rather than maximizing shareholder returns. Imagine communities organizing cooperative farms. Imagine farmers collectively owning equipment. Imagine neighborhood gardens producing vegetables. Imagine small ranchers forming voluntary cooperatives rather than being forced to depend upon giant meat packers. Imagine community owned slaughterhouses and processing facilities. Imagine local food distribution networks. Imagine farmers markets where the intermediary is eliminated whenever possible. Imagine community kitchens. Imagine food cooperatives where workers and consumers participate directly in the decision making. Imagine land being treated as something to be used by communities rather than an endlessly appreciating financial asset. That's where anarchism becomes practical. Decentralize the food system. The goal shouldn't be to replace one centralized food bureaucracy with another. It should be to decentralize power. Instead of enormous corporation controlling thousands of farms, thousands of communities control their own food systems. Instead of a handful of meat packers controlling processing, workers and producers operate cooperative processing facilities. Instead of distant corporations deciding what gets grown, farmers and communities decide what their communities need. Instead of throwing away food because it is unprofitable, surplus food goes to people who need it. Instead of destroying crops because market prices are too low, production can be coordinated around actual human consumption. Farmers and workers belong to the same side. One of capitalism's oldest tricks is convincing workers and farmers that they are enemies. The farmer is told the problem is the consumer. The consumer is told the problem is the farmer. The rural worker is told the problem is the urban worker. Meanwhile, corporations and financial interests sit between producer and consumer, taking their cut. The communist anarchist answer is bring the producer and consumer together. Their answer needs affordable equipment, land, veterinary care, processing, transportation, and guaranteed community market. The consumer needs affordable, healthy food. Those aren't contradictory interests. They are and can cooperate. What can we build? We don't have to wait for Washington. Communities can begin organizing now. Form food cooperatives, support small farms and independent ranchers, create community gardens, develop seed sharing networks, build local buying clubs, create community supported agricultural programs, organize cooperative meat processing where legally possible, create direct farmer to consumer markets, share tools and agricultural equipment, teach people gardening, preservation, canning, fermentation, animal husbandry, and food production, build relationships with rural producers and urban consumers. The objective is not merely to buy different products. The objective is to change who possesses the productive infrastructure. Don't replace one monopoly with another. A communist anarchist food system must also avoid becoming another centralized authority. The answer isn't government should control every farm. The answer is people should control their own communities through voluntary cooperations, federations, worker cooperatives, producer cooperatives, consumer cooperatives, and democratic associations. A dairy cooperative is one region can coordinate with and gain cooperation with another. A ranching cooperative can coordinate with a community owned processing facility. Urban food cooperatives can establish direct relations to rural farms. Communities can federate when cooperation requires larger scale infrastructure. The power flows horizontally rather than being concentrated at the top. Food sovereignty is freedom. The most radical thing we can do is make people capable of feeding themselves. A population dependent upon giant corporations for every meal is economically vulnerable. A community capable of growing food, preserving food, processing food, sharing food, and distributing food is much harder to control. That is why gardens matter. That is why farmers matter. That is why seed libraries matter. That is why community kitchens matter. That is why cooperatives matter. And that's why local food networks are political, not because everyone needs to agree on one ideology, but because control over the means of producing the necessities of life is control over our freedom. The real question. So, when we hear Trump is importing beef to lower prices, we should ask, why is beef so expensive in the first place? Why are cattle herds so small? Why are farmers drowning in input costs? Why are meatpacking facilities concentrated? Why does the consumer pay so much while producers struggle? Why does food travel thousands of miles? Why do communities have so little control over their own food supply? And most importantly, why do we accept systems where the necessities of life are controlled by whoever has accumulated the most capital? The communist anarchist answer is not simply import more beef, nor is it ban foreign beef. The answer is take food production out of the logic of endless profit and put it into the hands of the people who produce and consume it. Farmers, ranchers, farm workers, truckers, butchers, grocery workers, gardeners, cooks, consumers, communities together, not as subjects of a corporation, not as customers of a monopoly, not as voters begging politicians for cheaper groceries, but as people capable of collectively organizing the material necessities of life. No corporate food monopoly, no political control over food, no secret food system, no land, only land for those who cultivate it, food for those who need it, power to the producers and consumers, from corporate agriculture to community agriculture, from commodity to commons, from dependency to self-organization, from profit to human need, food sovereignty, worker control, community ownership. No gods, no masters, no corporate food lords.